Hey everyone, welcome back to the Bayside SF Giants talk show. Excuse me. I'm Marc Delucchi. He's Kerry Crowley. We're back to talk Giants. Kerry, how you doing?
Oh, doing great, Mark. Looking forward to this. And hey, we inch closer to the All-Star break. We're past the midpoint of the
That's
season.
true.
And
Yep.
every time the Giants have that opportunity to get to 500, they miss it, and then they start falling back. So it feels like we've completed this cycle a few times this year.
Yes, we are recording this on Sunday afternoon, and right after the Giants lost to the Guardians 5-4, which ultimately means they were unable to pull off a little above 500 road trip here. Obviously, they had a strong showing against Atlanta, taking 2 out of 3, won the first game in Cleveland against the Guardians, but ultimately dropped the two over the weekend on Saturday and Sunday, both losing both games 5-4. And it's just tough because I think the Giants, again, this is back-to-back weeks where I think they played overall good baseball. There's just again, a couple missed opportunities, right, where you're looking at a rally here, a defensive mistake or mental mistake here and there. They could have come out of this with 2 series wins against two really good playoff contenders on the road. But it's still good to see them being a competent team on the road, which frankly was something that we hasn't been true a whole lot this season.
Yeah, I think it's also good timing that they've played, I would say, much more consistent baseball over the last month. Like even their losses, you look at Mark, and against the Braves, it was competitive. Against the
Yep.
Guardians, it was competitive. Last Saturday night against the Dodgers, it was competitive. And so it's very different from those series earlier in the season where like they're in Philadelphia and they're getting blown out. Like I have complete confidence that right now, if you played a 4 game series against the Phillies, Giants could take one, maybe two of those games. And I couldn't say that a month and a half ago with where this team was. And so it's important, even though the record is not where we think it should be, even though the record certainly isn't where the Giants would like it to be, it's important in the bigger picture context of should this team be adding at the trade deadline and should this team be pushing to go, a little more all in than maybe they even were this offseason, even though their record isn't where, like I said, they need it to be at this point.
Yeah. And I think that's where the question then comes, what does that mean? Like I think this offseason, right? It was, it's the easiest part, right? Like if you're gonna be all in for something, the starting place for that this offseason, right, was going for the big fish, right? Going for Otani, going for Yamamoto. And then ultimately that meant, even though losing out on those guys, still getting Snell and Matt Chapman and Soler and Jung Hoo Lee and all these other players trading for Robbie Ray.
Yeah,
What does
absolutely.
all in mean for this team at the deadline, where there are fewer options and there is less flexibility in that?
Yeah, I think that all in is very different than what you would say like the Baltimore Orioles or the New York Yankees could be this year, the Dodgers, the Phillies. I think for the San Francisco Giants, it's adding and not subtracting this year because there
Mm-hmm.
will be some offers that could appear over the next few weeks that, hey, a team might see Michael Conforto's hot streak and say, this is someone who we want, as a left-handed platoon bat for us down the stretch. You could look at a pitcher coming back from the IL. I doubt that they'll get much interest in Blake Snell because of the contract or Robbie Ray because of the contract. But if Alex Cobb were to make a start or two before the trade
A
deadline, I
great
mean, he
point.
is someone who would have value to another team right now. And I think that the Giants should resist the temptation to sell and look at the market and see, hey, can we be a soft buyer here where we don't have to give up a top 10 prospect, but there are players out there who fit the Giants' needs. I think that you look at this roster, and Wilmer Flores isn't the player he was last year. Austin Slater wasn't the player he was last year. Even Tyro Estrada wasn't the player he was last year, which means that against left-handed starters, the Giants are vulnerable right now. And so, can you add a right-handed platoon bat who's an upgrade over one of those three players? Can you add to this bullpen that's been taxed
Yep.
so heavily, but could be a great strength for you if you're able to give Ryan Walker or Tyler Rogers a day off here and there and keep them out of 100 games this
Yeah.
season? I think that those are the considerations the Giants need to make. And there are a number of names that really intrigue me that I know are not going to cost the Giants, a Grant McCray or a Hayden Birdsong, one of these guys who are on the radar right now.
Yeah, and to be fair, and granted, I like McCray a lot too, but McCray is someone too. Again,
Yeah.
the 49 roster is heavy on the outfield side. He's gonna need to be protected from the Rule 5 draft. They were able to sneak him past the Rule 5 draft last year. I don't think the way he's playing, they're gonna be able to do that again this year.
Yeah.
But no, for sure, it's I think it's in play. I think the thing I ask you is when you think about resting that bullpen, What do you think Hayden Birdsong has earned a more prolonged opportunity at this point to, get some more looks in this rotation? Obviously, he is not going to give you the length that, you would love to get in a starting rotation, but also in the modern MLB, that's not necessarily what teams are looking for. You have the advantage of having Logan Webb in your rotation. You have the advantage of potentially, again, Blake Snell is scheduled. He should be back on Tuesday, right?
Mhm.
Who should be able to, or at least you're hoping, have an expectation to give you some length. Obviously, you mentioned Cobb and Robbie Ray, who are making rehab starts. There is kind of a logjam here. And so it's easy to say Birdsong back to AAA, but you've been a proponent of playing the young guys this year. I'm curious, how do you feel Birdsong kind of falls into that mix?
Yeah, I'm very intrigued by what the Giants do with their decision because I think that Birdsong, Harrison, and Hicks are all guys who you probably don't want going more than 4 innings.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that as a big fan of Hayden Birdsong. I say that as someone who believes in his stuff at the major league level. And I know that, it wasn't perfect against the Guardians on Sunday, but there were glimpses, and there have been glimpses of a Hayden Birdsong and showing truly special stuff. But I think folks have to remember he threw almost no innings in high school. He pitched at Eastern Illinois in college, where he was a
True.
reliever,
Yep.
came through the minor league system with 170 innings to his credit. I mean, this is not someone who's going to give you suddenly a 140 inning season, even if everything breaks well for him. And so I wonder, do you stack 3 innings of Birdsong with 3 innings of Harrison or 3 innings of Hicks? And does that
Mm.
become a start for you? Like, do the Giants think about it that way moving forward? Because Jordan Hicks might really want to stay in a starting role, and the Giants might really value him as, say, hey, post All-Star break, we kind of like you in the 7th inning and maybe the 8th inning if you're able to stretch out that way. So, do the Giants fix that by just saying, okay, Jordan, you can be a starter, but you're going 3 innings today,
Yeah,
and
that's a
just give us the best 3 innings there, and then Birdsong's going to come in behind you and give us 3 innings there. I think that there's just a number of different tweaks that they can make, but a lot of those tweaks are going to require outside additions and optioning Rodriguez, Jelly,
mm.
Miller when they've all pitched well, but to preserve Walker and Rogers and Doval, you're going to have to make some tough option decisions as well.
Yeah, and again, when you mentioned the taxed bullpen, it's hard to say Rodriguez, Miller, and Jelly, like they've been pretty integral to this. The reason I ask you the Birdsong question is you kind of stumble into where I was going, and this is where it comes down to relationship management is a thing that I think it's fair to say was I think one of the things Kapler struggled with when it came
Yeah.
to the clubhouse. I think there were a lot of people in the clubhouse who did very much like Kapler and had good relationships with him, but the fringes of the roster were where there was struggles. Like, again, I want to be clear. There were a lot of players who spoke out in favor of Kapler and like enjoyed their time there, but they were also all players who were fairly integral and didn't have their like permanent roles on the team in question. The guys who were optioned around, the players who, were getting kind of jerked around in roles pretty consistently, those were the ones who were dissatisfied. And that, part of that is management decision making, but part of that's also, understanding how to communicate that and having the rapport. Because you mentioned, how do you get Ryan Walker and Tyler Rogers and be a little less reliant there? And man, I look and say, hey, you got Jordan Hicks in the
Yeah.
rotation, and he's starting to look more hittable. He's not giving you the, early in the season when it's like this is Cy Young level. He's starting to fade a bit, and you have this kind of, you're in this very lucky position at the moment where, at least for now, right, with pitching, this is by the test time tomorrow, 3 more pitchers could be hurt. But at this moment, it's like Robbie Ray, Alex Cobb, Blake Snell are all pitching in games.
Mhm.
And that's on top of having a rotation right now, or I guess Snell is now in the rotation since he's going to be activated. But you have a rotation of Webb, Hicks, Harrison, and Birdsong and Snell, and then Robbie Ray and Alex Cobb are pitching in games. You still have Mason Black and other guys around in the minor leagues. Like, I, I do wonder if there's that conversation can be had with Hicks, because honestly, I mean, again, you could say that with Birdsong and Harrison too. It's just, you worry about. I think it's more easier to shift a guy in a role like Hicks, who obviously has done it before. You've seen do it in high leverage. There's, despite, well, Birdsong and Harrison have the stuff that you could say, hey, in the 1 inning role they'd be dominant. It's still a different conversation
Yeah.
versus Melvin going to Hicks. And again, I don't know what that relationship is. Hicks may have chosen the Giants over other teams because of that promise, and that isn't something that can change. But if you could say, look, Jordan, we don't want you to go from throwing 60 innings every, for 4, 5, 6 years to throwing 200. We're worried about your long-term health. You're on a 4-year contract. We're committed to you. How would you feel about post All-Star break, assuming health, you shifting into a bullpen role, joining Walker and Rogers and Doval, and really anchoring us, joining a really dominant pen. Look, if guys go down, maybe you get stretched out here and there. But look, we're still committed to you next year in the rotation. Cobb's going to be a free agent this offseason. Snell and Ray both have opt-outs. It's not out of the question they could pitch themselves into that. And, trades come up and stuff. Like, look, we're not moving you here because we don't want you to start for us next year. But hey, maybe this allows us to trajectory you into 120 innings this season, and then next year you can go the full 180. That's a conversation I think about, and I imagine something they obviously have a better handle on internally what that looks like, because I do think I agree with you. Like, there's the limitations of Birdsong's workload, but having the upside to me of Hicks in the bullpen, who in my head would essentially be replacing Luke Jackson, right? Whether that's a
Yeah. Oh,
DFA
yeah.
or a trade or something along those lines. I think there's a lot, like, I think Birdsong and Hicks in the rotation are kind of potentially giving you something similar, and versus moving Hicks to the pen instead of just sort of shifting around, whether it's just optioning Birdsong for, Snell or Ray and these other things.
Yeah, I think the sell for Jordan Hicks, if he truly wants to throw as many innings as possible and, maintain his ability to start next season, and the Giants come up with a vision for him where, hey, you can help yourself with this by pitching out of our bullpen, is maybe it's we're going to use you at multiple innings at a time out of the bullpen. Like, there could be days where the Giants have
Yeah.
a 3-1 lead in the sixth inning. Jordan Hicks comes in the seventh, and they want him to finish that ball game, or at least turn it over to Camilo Doval to
Yeah.
end that ball
Yeah,
game.
but yeah,
So
let us not use Rogers and Walker today, right?
exactly.
We can sort of alternate between Rogers, Walker, or vice versa in the seventh, eighth, and then some days we'll go Hicks seventh, eighth. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's kind of got to be the sell for Jordan Hicks there. And it also benefits the Giants if he's throwing still 30 to 45 pitches an outing
Mm,
as opposed to 15 to 20 pitches per outing. And so I don't think you have him change the stuff. And I don't think you have him say, hey, Jordan, remember when you were throwing 102 out of the bullpen for
mm.
St. Louis? Let's have you do that again. I think you try and attack it with the starter's mentality and say, hey, Jordan, you're coming in the sixth. And your goal is to get as many hitters as possible. We're capping you at 45 pitches. Finish this game if you can,
Yeah.
and then go from there.
Yeah, no, I think that's, and again, part of this is going to come to a head. Obviously, again, Cobb and Ray are on much slower timelines than Snell or than Harrison was because of the nature of the injuries they're returning from, and obviously Cobb's had one setback before. Setbacks happen in the circumstance, but they're both also 60-day IL spots, right? And like, they have one, it's open up. Colton Ingram is currently, in the on the big league roster, and the bullpen was a waiver claim, but he is probably going to be the first roster spot to be cleared for one of
They
those
didn't use him
guys.
when they were losing.
Yeah,
So
exactly. So, like, Ingram is probably the one who is going to, who knows, he might be DFA'd this week to make spot on the active roster. I guess he has an option left, I think. So he'd be optioned for Snell probably on Tuesday. But unless he's the 40-man spot, that's probably the most at risk. But again, I do look at, if all those guys are back and healthy, I really do look at the Luke Jackson roster spot, because, and again, it's why I think about Hicks, because the one point for Jackson is this is a dude who's been in a big league bullpen before. He throws back-to-back days. He knows, he has experience doing that. Where just the young guys, even though they've been more effective, there's just a level of comfort and familiarity for, when you're talking about pitching coach Brian Price, bullpen coach Garvin Alston, all that whole staff. Like, there's just a level of having a veteran in there that is, I think there is value to in the locker room and stuff. And so figuring out how they manage that. And so that brings me to then when we think about, I don't feel like there is really a move to be made on the pitching side that I see it in a clear upgrade, right? Like, I think the bullpen, like, I mean, unless there's like some consolidation that became available, right? Like, I just don't see a pitcher that's intriguing enough to me. If there's like a Birdsong and Carson Wisenhunt can get me some impact controllable young arm that I'm more confident in, I'd consider it. I'd think about it, but I don't see the pieces I'm seeing rumored on the trade front. I'm not seeing any closers or relievers or starters who are really moving me in that way.
no, I think you'd like someone who can throw multiple innings. And quite honestly, those guys just don't exist. You have to bring
Yep.
those guys through your farm system. And that has to be a plan in the middle of the season to where, I think if everything was perfect from a health perspective this year, I think Reggie Crawford could have been one of those guys. But he's obviously had the setback, and they've limited him to one inning at a time most of the time out of the bullpen.
And
In
3-4 days rest even out of the bullpen. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think that could have been a situation where they had spent the month of June and July building him up to two innings at a time.
Mm.
joins the bullpen in that capacity because he's going to be a starter down the line. I think they are so cautious with Reggie Crawford that that's not a consideration right now. To me, when they sent Landon Roop down early in the season, the goal for me would have been to stretch him out to 2 to 3 innings at a time, make sure that he can take on that workload because I still think he has some long-term starter upside for this team, even if they thrust him into the bullpen role at the beginning of the season. So I'm interested in seeing what they do with Roop next year, but I don't know that this is the year where they find a lot out about him. And maybe because of that, he could be someone who's dangled at the trade deadline because it's just difficult to use these 40-man roster spots on players who won't necessarily contribute in the role that you envision for them right now and maybe even in the future.
The other thing about that too, with the like construction of the pitching staff, is just, I mean, the whole roster, Giants aren't like the 2024 Giants could look a lot like the 2025 Giants right now. There's
Oh
not,
yeah,
there's
absolutely.
not really a lot of, again, like the free agents, Luke Jackson. Okay, we already kind of have internal replacements there. The starting rotation at the moment, no one's opting out. And the only way, right, Ray or Snell are doing that is if they have incredible finishes of the season, which is now the question. But in that scenario, you might want to bring them back. But otherwise, Cobb is set to walk. Well, they've made it this far without Cobb. We'll see if he ends up playing his way into the factor. And that's the other thing with the bullpen. I mean, he's looked good, and he did have kind of his first snag. Given his historic struggles with command, I think Robbie Ray might be the guy I'm bringing.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
I end up, like I think the Giants might be eyeing for a more like 2 to 3 inning swingman situation. Maybe it's Robbie Ray and Hayden Birdsong as the 5 in the rotation, thinking about what we were talking about earlier. Um, just because of his historic struggles with command.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. A guy who struggled with command before Tommy John surgery, coming back from Tommy John surgery. What's the last thing that comes back? It's your command, especially of the fastball. And so that's something that it's really concerning for Robbie Ray, even though the rehab outings, according to everyone who's watched them, have been so good so far for the Giants. And so I'm interested to see what they do there because you could theoretically have a situation where you pair Ray and Birdsong, Snell. Well, you'd like to use traditional relievers after Snell, but maybe Harrison and Hicks and figure things out that way. And you're maybe going with a 4-man rotation on certain days, and there's a little more rest during the second half of the season. But, I also wouldn't rule out the idea of the Giants acquiring like a fifth starter on a flyer, someone who could just eat innings a la Jeff Samardzija, even though those guys aren't really out there. But, when I think about what this team needs, it's more pitching depth that's established at the major league level. I think that they could benefit from one more reliever who settles a spot or one more fifth starter who just takes down 5 or 6 and is going to throw with a 4.5 ERA. And then it's another right-handed bat and maybe someone with some infield versatility. Like the name that comes to mind is Luis Rengifo of the Angels because
Mm-hmm.
they're going nowhere. He's a switch hitter. And so you can have him play a lot of second base. You could really figure that out. And maybe Tyler Fitzgerald finds himself on the Angels at some point in that kind of a trade because I think that, the Giants have shown that they can find the utility guys who play multiple positions and aren't going to ever really stick in one spot and establish themselves as a starter. Farhan's been good at that throughout his career, and that's a valuable roster spot, but that's something that I think the Giants can just find next year.
Yeah, man. If they could, I mean, I know Rengifo. I think he, is dealing with some wrist stuff, and I
Yeah,
hope
it's a
that
wrist
that clears.
issue, which isn't
Yeah,
great.
yeah. And so, but yeah, he's been having a really good year, and he's again been a consistently like just good player. Like just a solid player and something that helps the Giants a lot. Yeah. No, I agree with you. I mean, again, obviously, you love to find an impact bat. And again, we talked last week. You can check out that episode. When we talked about like Vlad Guerrero, Pete Alonso, like some names that could hit the market, right? And
Mhm.
ultimately, I think the Giants should be willing to meet those prices. And again, that could be the scenario, right? Hey, maybe this the reason the Birdsong we had him make 2 starts was maybe this was an audition because the Giants
Yeah.
want to go big game fishing for Robert. They want to go big game fishing for Guerrero or Bichette or whoever. And they say, hey, let's give Birdsong some MLB starts here. We know his stuff. He'll go 4 or 5 innings. He'll have his flaws, but that will, there's a lot of scouting departments out there that these 2 starts on top of what he's done in the minors is going to turn some eyes, right? Is going to gather some attention. And maybe that's how we sort of solve what could be a little bit of both just a 40-man and big league roster kind of logjam here is again maybe that's part of the thinking here too with giving the Giants haven't really given one player, the one young player, the priority opportunity. First at the start of the year was Mason Black. Roop got his shot as well. Roop got his chances, and now we see Birdsong get it. And I think part of that's just been riding the hot hand, sort of riding who is performing well at the minor league level. But I do wonder if part of that's also sort of a kind of broad audition approach from, look, these guys we're already going to have to get these players on the 40-man roster for the Rule 5 draft at some point anyway. They're gonna force that hand. So let's get them in front of some eyes that we are willing to trade anyone for the right player. And so if a team could fall in love with a guy that can potentially bring us into or put us over the top in getting that big piece, because when we talk about the Zaidi tenure, right, that's still the thing. The Giants have never really been able. I guess maybe we could talk about the Chris Bryant trade really being the only time that
Yeah.
it feels like there was one player who it fit the Giants were targeting and they were able to get across the finish line with, because otherwise, obviously in free agency, it's no secret that they just haven't been able to get across the finish line, and maybe they're able to do that this year at the deadline.
Yeah, they've got some really interesting opportunities at the deadline this year because they could also get not necessarily a star in Alonso or Luis Robert, but you can get an upper tier starter, someone who's reliable and consistent as either a position player or a major league starter in terms of the rotation. If you're willing to do like a 4-for-1 trade package,
Yeah,
if you
yeah,
would
yeah.
say, hey, here's Mason Black, Keaton Wynn, Tyler Fitzgerald, and
Hmm.
Wade Kessler,
Yeah, or some lower minors pieces,
there will
well,
be
of Diego Velasquez, whatever. Yeah, yeah,
exactly. There will be a team that takes on that upside.
yeah.
The Miami Marlins would immediately be better if they took on those four players. If they had Keaton Wynn starting every fifth day, be better than what they have in their rotation. The Giants
Yeah,
don't have opportunities for Keaton Wynn right now.
yeah.
They may not next year. And you've got all these players coming back from the 60-day IL. Tristan Beck is among them. I mean, there are some names who could go at the trade deadline simply in the type of Brett Wisely deal that got done a few years
Hmm.
ago, where I don't know if the Giants traded a 40-man guy for Brett Wisely at that
Hmm.
point, but they acquired Brett Wisely because of the incoming 40-man crunch of the Tampa Bay Rays.
Yep.
The Giants may want to just jettison some guys who they may not necessarily believe in as much. And I don't know who those guys are,
Hmm.
but I could absolutely see those type of deals, 3-for-1, 2-for-1 happening this July.
Yeah, and the tough part is, right, like the closest thing to the cavern right now, like the thing for the Giants is shortstop, right? Like that's the one, like when you talk about, what is the area? Because the fact is, Mike Yastrzemski has stabilized the season. Michael Conforto has stabilized. Like, yeah, there could be upgrades in the outfield, don't get me wrong, but the fact is, Conforto, Yaz, Heliot, Ramos are looking like that's a pretty solid outfield and probably the most well-rounded outfield the Giants have had in a long time, because Heliot Ramos is the greatest Giant in the 21st century, apparently. But the Giants are getting good production out of the outfield. Obviously, Lamont is having a great season, and the Giants are doing their best to keep him healthy. Like Brett Wisely filling in for Tyro has been very solid at second base. Eventually, Tyro comes back, but again, I think long term a Tyro Wisely platoon at second may end up being what the long term sort of solution is for both of those players. Matt Chapman again solidified. Jorge Soler starting to stabilize a bit. It is shortstop where Nick Ahmed again is giving them great defense. He's giving them. I mean, he's doing what we expected, right? Like
Yeah.
he's stabilized that position defensively. But that when you see an on base and slugging both below 300, it's just it's hard not to look at that and see that's the place for upgrade, right? Like that's the place where if you could just get a league average shortstop, a league average bat who is a good defensive shortstop in that place, it does alleviate a lot of the strain that has been watching the Giants this season, right? Which is there's a couple hits, the rally's building. I'm thinking about the conversation you had with Stephen Vogt where he talked about needing 3 hits in an inning, right? And then
Yeah.
it's Nick Ahmed coming to the plate because we're at the bottom of the lineup, right? And and to be fair, to Ahmed, he's come in through in quite a few of those situations this season. But that's where the Giants, because it's really Heliot Ramos and then some solid above average here, but really right now it's Heliot Ramos and a bunch of average hitters.
Yeah.
That length is what you need for that lineup, right? If you aren't going to be able to get the Robert or the Alonso, because again, I do think one more impact bat really has a huge effect. But even if it's just one impact bat and length, then you need to strengthen that length out, and shortstop is the place right now that is that cavern, right?
Isn't it amazing that you could pull off a blockbuster for Bo Bichette, who's having kind of a terrible season at the plate. Like Bo
Yep.
Bichette's offensive numbers have been awful, or you could make a small trade that wouldn't cost you a lot in terms of prospect capital and acquire an above average player at the shortstop position from an offensive perspective and get the
Quickly.
guy you mentioned last week, Paul DeYoung. Like Paul DeYoung is 5% better than league average at shortstop this
It's
year.
also good defensively.
He's already a forever giant. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I
Right.
mean, it
He's
would be
significantly better than Nick Ahmed right now.
and that's the I mean, and this is the thing I wonder if because you got to be you know if you're in the front office having the conversation whether it's Zaidi or someone else that you're just thinking like we did just do this and it
Yeah.
didn't work well.
The
And
fans would just
oh
crush
yeah,
him.
absolutely.
This would be AJ Pollock 2.0.
And the thing about it that is rough with DeYoung is I remember because yeah, obviously I was on the beat last year when it happened and I was writing about it. Like DeYoung's numbers were better than the Giants shortstops up to that point. He like would have been an upgrade, and then it was just by the second half of the season he was regressing and didn't do much for the Giants. But yeah, I mean, I it's tough. I mean that's the difficult decision. The difficult part of having a need at a defensive premium position,
Yeah.
right, is that it is not as simple. Again, like I'm not saying don't go get Pete Alonso. I'm not saying if you can, but also like Pete Alonso is playing a position that Lamont Wade plays, and you have Soler. Like again, it's an upgrade. I go do it. I figure out where you play the guys later. The Giants shouldn't have traded Orlando Cepeda because they were out of left field first baseman. But like it is just a thing of when you're looking at it, it's like it's like if there's the impact shortstop, and of course there isn't one, right? The Twins ain't trading Carlos Correa to you, and like there isn't. It really would be Bichette, and you're betting on what is a very long and successful track record, but nevertheless, he's hitting, as I look at it, at 225 with a 278 on base and a 324 slugging,
Yeah. I mean,
slightly better than Nick Ahmed.
it's also slightly better than Tim Anderson.
Yep.
It's really like I look around and is Ahmed Rosario the best option? The guy that the Dodgers went after last year? I mean, seriously, the shortstop market is so thin, and it's why the Giants have been insistent on keeping Marco Luciano at that
Yep.
position throughout his minor league career because if he's even remotely competent at the
Yep.
shortstop position, it's a game-changing player
Yeah.
in your franchise for the next 10 years. And the Giants
And it's
saw
why they
Kerry
didn't move
Crawford.
on. And which, again, I think they do deserve credit for this because they got some criticism for this. It's why they rolled with Nick Ahmed at the start of the season and weren't
Yeah.
willing to just let him walk because they knew he had premium defense. And, it just letting him go, he would have signed somewhere else and that he would have been unavailable to the Giants. And think about where they'd be at shortstop right now. Think about where they'd be in the middle infield if they hadn't had him for this rotation,
Yeah.
throughout the season.
It's think about where the Giants would be without Nick Ahmed.
Hey, that's my take. Yeah, that's where I'm putting my hat this week.
I love it.
I
I
love our
love
podcast because I never know what I'm gonna say. Yeah, well, and this is, I guess, where we will have for this 7,000th time, but nonetheless, there is the Marco Luciano conversation when it
it.
comes to
Yeah.
short, because I mean, it's hard for me to look at minor league numbers at this point. Like I know, I think it was The Athletic. I think it was what y'all were doing. It had a pretty good piece on the changing minor league landscape and
Yeah. Yeah.
what
Cody Stavenhagen.
yeah,
Yeah.
and talking about like how it's gotten even harder to take things away from minor league statistics, in part because of the changing run environment, in part because of ABS, but also just a really big part of it is the really nasty effects of Manfred sort of insisting on the Lunau plan and cutting down the number of minor league players and organizations. So just across the board, it's made it, again, minor league stats were never like a one-to-one translation anyway, and it's made that even harder. And the Giants have had all these guys who were in the big leagues for a decent chunk of last year and are back in the minor leagues this year. And there's just usually speaking, there is a mental gap that can come from that. There's a mental frustration that can come from that. And at the same time, it's like I look at Marco Luciano's numbers at AAA, and it's like, well, I can't trust that. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like I'm not in a position to give him an opportunity off that. I mean, again, he's much younger than Joey Bart was in this situation. I'm going to be much more patient with Luciano. The Giants are going to be more patient with Luciano, I think, than they were with Bart. Or I should say they're earlier in the stages of where they were, this is, with Luciano than they were with Bart this year when they moved on.
Yeah. I mean, look, Heliot Ramos was terrible as a 22-year-old.
Yeah.
Heliot Ramos was terrible as a 23-year-old.
Yeah.
Heliot Ramos is tremendous as a 24-year-old.
Yeah.
Development, as our friend Roger Munter says, is not
Not
linear.
linear.
And for Marco Luciano, it could be more growing pains over the next 2 years before he becomes the player that the Giants would love him to be, before he becomes the player that I think he can be at
Yeah.
the major league level, which is someone who's a really solid everyday player. I have no clue what position he'll play long term, zero idea. But I do know that that bat's going to play one day. Like I
Mhm.
think that I've seen enough players come up to the major league level, struggle to figure out, and then finally make those adjustments. And I just think like he's in the right mindset as a hitter when I've seen him this year compared to last year. If you're making the mindset growth, I think that you can continue to evolve as a player. It's the players who, they've maxed out their physical ceiling and then mentally, you've kind of seen them make the adjustment back and forth and back and forth. And then,
Yeah.
okay, it's probably not going to work out for him. I still think there's a lot of adjustment left in Marco Luciano's game. And I think he's made some of those adjustments this year. And so as long as he keeps evolving, I'm going to continue to be bullish on this guy.
Yeah, the thing I don't know what to do with, and again, we've talked about this when it comes to player development that the Giants have had, and if Heliot Ramos is looking like a development success, or obviously is a success in some form, where credit goes is hard to tell. But one thing that was true about Ramos is when he got to the upper minors and his power disappeared, his production was terrible, his strikeout rates were slashed, his walk rates started to go up. That was a thing that happened.
Yeah.
Luciano is walking at the highest rate of his career this season. His strikeout rates are lower than they were at any level last year, for what that's worth.
Yep.
It's about where he was at Double A. Again, I'll say though that was also true about Joey Bart in the minors with the Giants, right? Like there's been a trend of the Giants with a lot of their prospects, particularly ones who the critique is the approach, that when they get to the upper minors, it seems like their emphasis on plate discipline and approach leads them to change their tendencies and their pitch selection stuff, which leads to them seemingly putting the ball in play more, seemingly walking more, but also seemingly their power disappearing. Obviously Bart's been hurt in Pittsburgh, so we haven't really been able to see whether that hot start he did there was sustainable. I honestly am very curious to see what Joey Bart becomes, in part because I am trying to sort of figure out what to make of the Giants development strategy, right? Like because Heliot Ramos is, I just think, such a difficult one for me to it's hard for me to give credit to the Giants because to me how they de-emphasized him. Like, not to say that coaches and stuff, but it feels like he did a lot of work on his own as well that has helped him take a step forward in the offseason.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but it's really, we have him, and then Patrick Bailey obviously is the other obviously player development success who kind of got pushed to the majors, and to his credit has hit above what I would have expected, hit above kind of his weight class of expectation given what he did in the minors. But Bailey was also a hit over power prospect, right? And the power over hit prospects have been the one that I think they tend to be more miss anyway. Like, it's a higher risk profile because strikeouts and making contact is such a difficult thing to do in the modern major leagues. But again, that's where Casey Schmidt did this last year too, right? Where the strikeout rates got slashed, walk rates looked a bit better, but the power kind of disappeared in the
Yeah.
upper minors. And so that's, I think, going to be the thing: is Luciano, is this him recalibrating approach, and then maybe it's August of this year, maybe it's in the next couple of weeks, or maybe it's next season where we get that Heliot Ramos quick click, right, where it comes together, where now the strikeouts begin to spike begin to increase a bit, but that's because the power is coming back and it's coming with a better, more selective approach. Again, we'll see with Luis Matos is one, right, where approach and Casey Schmidt, I think both could benefit from a better approach. Luciano could have benefited and will benefit from a better approach, but it's just walks and strikeouts are proxies for approach. They are
Yeah.
not all of approach, right? There are players who are very good players who strike out 30% of the time in major leagues and don't necessarily walk a whole lot because they're hitting the ball really hard. They're hitting for a lot of power. That's what Ramos is shown the ability to do this year. Teoscar Hernandez, other guys, I mentioned Adolis Garcia, right? Another guy who potentially Ramos is looking like he has that ceiling in him if he really puts it all together. So we'll see. I mean, I do think if we talk about the Giants' second half of the season, and we can wrap here, like, if there was one thing you could pick for this Giants that would be true for the next few months for one player, what would it be?
Oh gosh, in terms of
Just the
like,
impact I mean, yeah, I guess it's up to you sort of whether you want to prioritize the sort of short-term goal of this year or the long-term, like, building for the future. But
I mean, I always I love thinking and talking big picture, but I prioritize the short term in almost everything for a sports franchise, and owing it to your fans to put the best possible product on the field, get as many wins as possible in the short term, and then figuring out the long term. So with that, I would say getting Blake Snell and Robbie
Yeah.
Ray to be 5 and 6 inning guys who consistently start for you every fifth
Yeah.
day would be huge. That would be
Yeah.
absolutely massive. And we will not see the best version of the Giants unless that happens. So,
Yeah.
what are you taking?
Yeah, I mean, getting one of them to be essentially the co-ace, right? Like,
Yeah.
and that would just be transformational. I think I lean towards that as well, in part because, again, I see the recipe of this team. It's always been they're still hovering. You get that rotation locked in, you get that bullpen locked in. I really don't think it's a matchup any team is going to want in the postseason. I just think that pitching staff has really incredible potential when you think
Yeah.
about what that team can do in the playoffs. But given where our conversation ended, and since you already picked it, I think it would be Marco Luciano figuring it out. I mean, like,
There we go.
if like again, I'm not a believer that Luciano will be an above average shortstop, but I do think I've seen him look like a capable big league shortstop. And again, I think his bat is good enough to potentially, make that a doable long-term thing. We'll see. I know there's like clearly there were some mental things earlier this year, right, that he was struggling with. And so we'll see how that develops. But hey, I think nothing would be more impactful than him being able to be a league average defensive or a league average offensive shortstop and maybe a slightly below average defensive shortstop. I think that'd be really impactful for the team, both short and long term.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that.
Yeah. And on that note, that'll be it for this week's edition of the Bayside SF Giants podcast. I'm Marc Delucchi. That's Kerry Crowley. We'll be back next Monday. See ya.